let's start. This is an experiment. My name is Nicolaus Schafhausen. I'm Fogo Island Arts Strategic Director. I'm here together with Shea. She is filming us at the Museum of Contemporary Art of MOCA in Toronto. And I'm have the pleasure to introduce you to Romano Paynter, who is the artistic director, MOCA's artistic director, Rui Mateus Amaral. I will pronounce it like this. Yes, that's right. And, yeah, he's the adjunct curator. And the third curator, Daisy Deposier. Well, Daisy Deposier can't be with us, but she's here definitely in spirit and thought for sure. Maybe she's online, and maybe she's online. So, hi Daisy. So, what are we going to see here? Why are we here? This program is part of our Fogo Island Arts Conceptual agency digital series, which we started a couple of months ago. That came out of everything what we have lost and also found during the pandemic in which we are still in. Yeah, whoever Rui.
So, thank you for joining us. We're going to do a walkthrough of the exhibition based on the art. So this exhibition is kind of a survey at the current moment, certain context, that being GTA, Toronto. There are 21 artists or art collectives in the exhibition. We'll touch on some of those today, but all the work in the show has been commissioned as a view. So we worked with the artists over a period of almost a year, but maybe more for some of them, to discuss the production of the new work. And the core question that we asked them all was, what do you find urgent today? And maybe responding to the current complexities of the last year and thinking about what to produce with a support structure and few curators.
When have you had the idea of this concept of a new triennial? Yeah.
We started probably doing studio visits in June 2020, which was a very kind of charged moment, both in terms of the pandemic, but also in terms of questions around social justice. And so it was kind of very raw, and we really wanted to look at, to really think about where we are, who do we serve, both in terms of the artistic community, but also in terms of our audience. And really trying to practice the politics of care in the best way that we know how. And also to question where we are in terms of, what is the GTA? How far does it extend? Who lives here? Who is coming here? And so this show, we wanted to turn into a triennial because these are relevant questions all the time, right? And so one thing that Toronto has lacked is a kind of structure or platform that constantly is checking in on artists. And so that's why it was really important for us to create a triennial that is constantly supporting artists. So that way studio visits are happening all of the time. And then this dialogue is actually ongoing and not just kind of occasional or once in a while.
That means the kind of departure was covered.
It was, but I think what we took from that was really, obviously being at distance and doing a lot of the work on Zoom.
Yeah.
And we use the word relationships a lot. So rather than talking about curators and artists and designers, we were talking about like a whole bunch of relationships that we're going to build this project. And I think, coming out of the experience of being locked down as well, these people meeting and really there's this resonance. There's an understanding between everyone participating in this project, but it was a shared experience.
Yeah.
So that was the most important element of that period.
Creating or doing local exhibitions is not an easy task. No, not at all. Because in the way you want to put artists on the other side who are not in this exhibition. Absolutely. And I think we are all aware of this. There are around the globe. I've been traveling quite extensively in the summer in Europe, and one of the most interesting local shows, so-called local shows I have seen was at the Garage Museum in Moscow. And I had many discussions there around why have you chosen this artist and not this artist, and then we were talking about the lack of visibility. So which I think which unifies, I think, all local, especially local artists. Absolutely, from the start. That was the main. That was the basis of their concept. You have a subtitle here of that show. I was to be honest, a bit surprised reading this. The most energizing
Artists.
Artist.
One of the most energizing artists.
Yes.
It's just marketing.
Kind of, yes. I think, I think the MOCA as well is like, we've only been in this building 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
We've been closed for the majority of that. We've only been functioning for 1 solid year in 2019. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done as well to get the museum on the map, as well as the artists, as you just expressed, needing to get some kind of attention to their practice. So we really wanted to make sure that the wider general public also had a kind of sense of what they were going to see. I think just calling it Greater Toronto Art, I've also acknowledged that some people don't even know what GTA stands for, and they're in the GTA. So I think we just needed that kind of extra push, and the marketing piece really does help in terms of like when you go out into the city, just acknowledging like what kind of things you're going to see in the space.
I've seen the show 2 months ago, and I was very much impressed before we go in, or before you start the tour. Fogo Island, just a month ago, we opened also a local show. Yeah? So that is very much different from this show, because on Fogo Island is a small island off the coast of Newfoundland, and we were so surprised, as we knew it already, so we have never done it, a local show. But people, how creative, not all are artists, but creative thinking and working people responded to our vocal call on the island. It was fascinating, and we definitely going to continue this in the future as well. I think we learned a lot. Well, I see the positive aspects, also what we have learned of the COVID. We call it Corona cell, in which
Yes.
So, Rui, November.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly interrupt? I think there's a little bit, the audio is a little bit difficult because of the masks.
Okay.
So if you guys can just try and speak as closely as
We
possible.
will, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
One thing we should probably preface the walkthrough with saying is that although we chose to forgo a kind of large thematic structure, we did ask every single participant or contributor, I should say, what feels most urgent to you today. But unfortunately, the architecture is so that we can't have all of the artists kind of in dialogue with each other on one floor. So we did have the task of trying to understand how do we create 3 different experiences over the 3 floors that brings all of these artists together. And again, rather than trying to create something that is very kind of overarching or presumptuous, we decided to kind of identify maybe 3 sentiments, 3 feelings, 3 keywords that kind of open up meaning on every single floor. So the ground floor we titled ambivalence, the second floor we titled inheritance, and the third floor we titled mutation. So we'll start with ambivalence, which is on the ground floor.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to the local note, we'll see this immediately is, I think we were really interrogating that notion of the local, because so many of the artists practicing in Toronto obviously are from somewhere else and they have moved to a different place in their career. So the first artist we'll look at is Bizarre Afsamani, who we've actually been speaking to for about 4 years about doing a project at MOCA, and this was the moment to do so. I think often that happens as a curator, you wait and wait, and then you realize it's a particular moment. We started talking about a work that we wanted to be a public-facing work. So this is actually part of the Year of Public Art in Toronto, Artworks TO, and it's called Mashrabiyah, and it's based on the Mashrabiyah, the Islamic green coverings you often see in that part of the world that have different jobs. They stop, they change the airflow. They also allow the light to be filtered into spaces, but they also allow the people inside to see out, but the people outside not to be able to see in. And often, you're talking about the women being inside and internally in the household. So she really wanted to play with this notion of the public and private. So this artwork obviously is on the facade of the building. It's a public sculpture. You can see it at any point in the day. You can only fully experience it if you then come into the space of the museum. So that question of, is the museum a public space? Is it a private space? How does that function?
And then one thing that was also really important for us in this exhibition is also to work not only with people who see themselves as artists, but also people who see themselves as industrial designers or product designers or publishers, really the idea of thinkers. And so this project by Tom Chung, which Rebecca was going to talk about, is really a beautiful kind of embodiment of that, of kind of taking something, a practical kind of question, and having it kind of go through someone who produces works like this, but also thinks conceptually and artistically. So this, although it appears like a shop, is actually also conceptual artwork. Rebecca, do you want to talk about this?
Sure. So this was one of the very clear productions that we wanted to do from the beginning. We actually approached Tom and asked him to create a conceptual shop that would function as a shop. So he had a lot of parameters around the request, and that's what he enjoys working to respond to. But he's really interested in democratic design and also like producing the product locally. So he does a publication called Local Source, which is kind of the beginning of the conversation that we had. And the project he came up with is titled 50 Shelves for MOCA. There were 50 shelves. So these 50 shelves are also a shop in and of themselves, so people can acquire them. So over the course of the exhibition, the shop is slowly kind of dissolving away. There's a stamp on the bottom of each one, an engraving that mentions the project, and the shelves are sold at cost. So he really wanted people to understand sort of, the background of like what it means to produce a piece of design and how that piece of design can take on an artistic quality in an art space like this, but then it goes into somebody's home and it completely transforms and has a whole different existence in a domestic setting. So the 50 shelves, I think, now are reduced to 38. And then they do hold some of the content that we produce for the exhibition, the notebooks, the publication bag, and also a series of editions by some of the artists. So again, giving the artists an opportunity if they want to think about, their own participation in a project like this, and where value lies, and the fact they can actually sell some of their work.
And we sell the shelves at, I don't know if you mentioned, for $250, which is actually the cost of production. And Tom really wanted this idea of, again, the cash and carry. So when you buy it, you carry it with you. And as a result, we then, as the museum staff, have to constantly reconfigure the shop as well. So it's also depleting at the same time that the product it actually holds is depleting as well. And then 80% of the proceeds goes towards a local charity called the Migrant Workers Alliance, which helps migrant workers to come and work our land in Northern Ontario during the summers with kind of better living conditions and with potentially obtaining rights in this country. So that's also really important, the idea of also whatever we receive for the product also goes back into the local as well.
We're going to look at another work by Ghazaleh Abazamani. We have been speaking about this project as well as the Mashrabiya from the very beginning, and it's called Broken Circle. And essentially, a lot of her work actually focuses on game and play, hierarchical structures, the notion of rule books, breaking down the rule book. How can we participate? How can we change our perspective to create a different kind of game structure in life? So this work here, she took a normal spinning top, a plastic spinning top, and then started projecting shadows with light. And those shadows, she produced about 100, were then formed in 3 dimensions in wood. And you see here a littering of 300 of the objects, 100 different formations. And obviously some spin and some are almost completely flat, askew. So we go back to the idea of ambiguity and access and power structures. And the public can also come and they can play with these, as Rui is demonstrating right now. Ask questions or not?
Yeah, people can ask questions. It's a good point. So if there are any questions, you can pop them into the chat and then we can respond to them.
This here is an installation by Walter Scott. At the core of many of you might know Walter Scott's work through his comic book series, Wendy, which is kind of very famous. And Wendy is an artist in the art world who is maybe an extension or alter ego of Walter, but a lot of the comic books take on this idea of kind of the ridiculousness of the art world, but also the pressure, sometimes unnecessary, or the power dynamics in the art world. And at the core of Walter's work, I think, is this idea of anxiety, the anxiety of being an artist, the anxiety of being a cultural worker, in the sense that, at once we both want to have a public persona, we want to produce objects or works that kind of have a public life, but at the same time, that process actually mortifies us. And so all of his works, interestingly, are in this like 1 foot in, 1 foot out, this in-between state. If you look at this sculpture, it's actually running out of the installation. It's actually running through the door, trying to exit at the museum, which is kind of this interesting kind of action. But also there's this idea of anxiety in the sense that there are things in the installation that are trying to communicate with each other, or communicate with the audience, but they're doing that through the comfort of their shelves, their crates. These neon works, as an example, were pre-existing works, and they were shown at Ashley, which is an artist center in Berlin. And they were shown kind of very traditionally in the sense that, they go on the wall, the wires were kind of cleaned up. But then when Walter actually received the neons in his studio, he just opened them up, plugged them in, and thought, oh my God, how beautiful. They really feel like they're trying to communicate something. They feel much more like language or something that is unsayable. And so that anxiety or mistranslation, that in-between space is kind of embodied in these works. And likewise, Walter's also not particularly interested in the pristine or kind of the absolute or kind of fixed meaning, which is why everything, as you notice, is also on wheels. Everything is not on your conventional kind of plinth. Everything is movable and transitory. Likewise, I love so much how he dealt with the pillars in the room. He literally addressed them by dressing them and turning them into kind of nervous figures themselves. So here you kind of see one of the pillars starts with this coat and is kind of fully zipped up. But as you move from pillar to pillar, they end up in this kind of state of being finally denuded and kind of naked and vulnerable. And then we paired that with an installation by Julia Dalt. And Julia Dalt is an artist that, of course, many people in Toronto know here. But we, with many of the artists, and I should say that one thing that was interesting for us in the process was it was an artist that maybe we wouldn't have anticipated creating 2 or 3 years ago, because there was so much new research. There was so much word of mouth and discovery in terms of what artists were new to the GTA, which artists were about to leave, or which artists we didn't even realize were working here. Or in the case, some artists like Julia, maybe someone like Tony Romano, let's say, are artists who are well known, who we really wanted them to reveal something new about their practice. And Julia is definitely one of those artists who is known more for her painting and kind of sculptures. But in this case, she really pushed her practice, and she was thinking a lot about accessibility. What in this moment is the use of art? Why do we have art? And she started to think also about this idea of the fix, the idea that when, as cultural workers, we make so many decisions for the audience. The painting goes here, the didactic panel says this, the overarching theme is this. But actually, what would happen if the audience had a choice? If they can actually participate in the exhibition design, in the meaning of artwork. So here she's created this curtain system where you can actually, as a viewer, choose what you want to see. Or maybe you don't want to see anything. And that's an option as well. And so these are all images from her archive. Something that a lot of people don't know is that her paintings sometimes often start off as representational paintings, even though they appear abstract in the end. And she's been having this archive that she calls found abstraction, where she collects images from different other archives and publications that she kind of uses as sources of inspiration for compositions, for color, sometimes for titles. And so she's really in this moment using curtains to reveal and also hide at the same time. And so many of the artists on this floor, which is why we called it ambivalence, really play with this idea of works that are double-sided, that are kind of just hanging on, that kind of have multiple points of view and not just one. They have 1 foot in and also 1 foot out. And really that is potentially a position of power and not so much of weakness, which ambivalence typically culturally is considered. So yeah, that's floor 1.
It's floor 1.
Yeah, so
Now we're going to go up the stairwell. And I think we might be able to hear it. There's currently a sound installation in the stairwell. It's not part of the exhibition, but it's a new series we're doing against to push out the parameters of what kind of works we can show at MOCA. So there will be a sound installation every 2-3 months in the stairwell going forward. And this one's by a collective called Unit 2 and T-Base.
This is also a nice moment because actually it's in the stairwells where you get to see the building at its most raw. It's kind of most industrial state. It used to be, it was known as the Tower Automotive Building. And then it was used as a factory for kitchen parts.
And during World War II, there was ammunition camp. So it has a very loaded history. And in the past, we have done quite a few projects to think about the labor and the activities that actually took place in this building.
This is the sound installation.
So on this floor, we titled it Inheritance. And a very kind of straightforward reading of that is the idea of inheriting property, goods, genes. And so many of the artists on this floor work from a particular document, a familial figure, a piece of folklore. And the thing with when you inherit anything, it's actually both a gift, but it's also a burden in the sense that, you know, what do you do with it? How long do you keep it for? And do you give it away? And what do you bring with you into the future? So this is the question, or a set of questions that many of the artists on this floor can explore. And so we open the show, this particular floor, with this pairing between Pamela Fetzigo-Sundstrom and Tony Romano.
Is that Tony first?
Yeah, sure.
So Tony Romano, again, an artist that many people will be aware of his practice, one of the more known artists that we've worked with. We approached him, actually Rui went out to the studio at one point and realized that he'd moved out of the city during COVID and he started working with his hands again in a much more kind of concentrated fashion. Yeah. So doing more carving, making sculptural works in this very amazing barn. But all of these works are sort of built from sourced or found materials. And his idea of inheritance is very much leading into certain sculptural pieces such as this with the double figures. He, when he started clearing and excavating this farmland to make it arable, he and his partner had sourced all these little pieces of pottery. So rather than throw those away, he actually kept them all and then produced this sculptural composition. But I think what's so beautiful about the works is really that there's this coming together and falling apart again, this idea that, they seem very fragile, and there are elements that seem like the sculpture over here, the horse, it's burnt. So there's this kind of like fragility to them, but they're also a composition that's coming together and there's hope. This is a carousel horse that he found, and then he actually worked on carve out extra detail and new detail, and then created this layered patina with the burning. There's another detail here that we see. He's made a series of chairs, actually. This is just one of them. So he found chairs again. But he started thinking about his own heritage and culture, coming from a Catholic and Italian background. And he started carving into the bottom of the chairs. And they're based on misericors, which are sort of medieval carvings that you often find under church pews in that part of the world, where people would literally kind of sit upon their most simple thoughts, suppress those thoughts. And here, rather than suppressing those thoughts, he's turning the chair and it's facing the world.
And likewise, he also, something that also maybe a lot of people, many people identify Tony as a sculptor, but he's also a beautiful watercolorist. And so at the beginning of lockdown, he actually started to create a self-portrait in watercolor every single day. So here, if we move to the watercolors, you can see that we presented what is one entire month of self-portraits.
And the whole composition is titled Between the Lilies and Birds, which is a reference to Kierkegaard and also to religion. The idea that the birds and lilies will look after themselves, God will provide.
There was also a question from the audience.
There is.
Yes, which is, I believe, about what's the difference between a concept store and a conceptual store. Well, I think the idea, going back to my retail background, actually, I think the idea of a concept store is defined by its radicality to a store that is kind of one brand specific. The idea of a concept store was the idea of actually having a multi-brand experience in the sense that There's someone who is not just a buyer, but actually an editor, is kind of an aesthete who is bringing a soap from this brand, a sweater from this brand. And really it's about the idea of a vision or kind of a lifestyle that is kind of being projected, but they use the word concept as being like basically a synonym for lifestyle, for being a synonym for basically like taste, let's say, right? And but a conceptual store is really one that is functioning as something that is it's hard to describe, but conceptual in the sense that it actually pushes us, right? The fact that all of the questions that we have to come with is like, what happens if someone buys all of them?
Yeah.
What are the new fixtures we have to use? Do we use any fixtures? Does it remain empty? I think that's where it is. It's where like there's the questions that come out of it are actually quite critical. I think Tom's work is critical in that sense, right? I mean, what is more an image of our times than a retail store that is doomed to disappear the minute it opens, right?
But it's both a store and not a store at the same time.
Yeah.
And there's shelves, but they're also not shelves. You know, and I think the other thing he was referring to when we were working together on the project was during COVID, if we go back to that moment, you know, a lot of these shops are shutting down. Like, what does it mean to even have a physical apparatus as a shop right now? And then a lot of those people also had to shell off the whole support structure. So then there's a whole discussion about support structures, and you know, you can really dive deep then around museology and you know how we support the structures on display. So I think that's where we're looking for.
Yeah. Should we move on to Pamela?
Yeah. So we'll touch on Pamela Simos-Ström's installation here, which, you know, it's a phenomenal work. She is known as a painter, but she describes her work as drawing. Normally you'll see like one canvas on a wall, and this really pushed her practice. When we started talking to her, we showed her the space on Zoom, and she immediately was thinking about how she wanted to push into more kind of theatrical backdrop works. She was thinking about that period as well in terms of like the flexibility of a pop-up fair. Like what would it mean to create such a kind of incredible, precious work in one sense, but also have it installed in a manner that, you know, it can be pulled down and put back up. It's almost like a tent structure. So she started working with the two outside panels, which already existed. This was the first time she'd done a backdrop in this way for another project. And you'll see, you know, she really references the vastness of time and the vastness of our heritage and the complexities of culture. You see often the volcano appearing in different moments throughout her work, which is really about kind of rebirth and the beginning of the planet. And then at the center, there's often a character or characters that are sitting kind of like within as if they're having a portrait taken. This is one of the few works where you don't actually see who they are, you don't see their faces, but the characters create this perspective whereby, and you can see it, you know, the feet go slowly ever into the distance, into the past, and the layerings of all these different textures and references to different kind of costumes and clothing. She was born in Botswana, and she lived in South Africa. She now lives in Ottawa. You know, she has a lot of heritage to bring with her. And other details you'll see, there are 13 panels. And when she was working on the space, she really wanted to incorporate the columns. So they're arched around the columns. And then there are details within the work where the columns, they come to the foreground here. And other details such as the measurements, which come from our initial conversations about this particular site. So this really is a very site-specific work. And again, with the drawing practice, you know, she leaves the lines from the first studies, and it really creates this kind of sort of dynamic of again, time passing and the layers, and also something kind of durational about the work. And she wanted people to see, if we come to the side, as we move to the next phase, she really wanted people to acknowledge, as many artists in the show, again, this idea of support structures. She wanted people to see how this work is installed and the labor that went into that.
That's something that's also interesting too, is that while we had to buy architecture and space to divide the show into three, there are many artists who are kind of reaching from their floors and speaking to other artists as well. So you'll see that come up a lot. So directly behind is this work by Ashuna and Alexa Hatsunaka. And this is a large-scale, loose, abstract map that connects where both of their respective grandmothers were from. So Ashuna it's like Ashuna's grandson. And so this map, this point is in Nunavut, which is where Pitsalak was born. And then this abstract, almost heartbeat-like line traces the movement of the Northwest Passage all the way from the north of Canada to Oklahoma, Japan, which is actually where Alexa's grandmother is from. And so this map actually connects not only their ancestries, but also the tradition of printmaking. In the 1950s, printmaking was brought by James Houston from Japan to the Arctic. And it's actually the artists in Nunavut who are really keeping the tradition alive. Ashuna in our interview in the catalog talked about how this is very much also an homage to Inuit ingenuity in the sense that they have created, new colors from printmaking, new systems of hanging and drawing and assembling. And on the topic of assembling, these works were all made together in Nunavut individually, and then they were sent here to Paper House Studio, where they were actually assembled into what you see here, which is essentially a map that is about 10 by 14 feet.
Yeah, I mean, some of the detailing, these are the sort of snow fields of the Arctic and the moving and shifting ice banks, which also people in that region use to understand the geography and to navigate. So, this layering of a map upon what is a kind of considered indigenous knowledge mapping structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also it's worth really looking behind as well. Something they didn't anticipate was also how the light transferring through all the crevices would actually create this kind of experience of a lantern in behind, which is quite beautiful. And also, in some ways, emphasizes the kind of fragility and kind of beauty of this particular collaborative piece. And then we'll highlight this work by Azza El-Siddiq. And this piece is called Fade into the Sun. It's one of her most ambitious installations. And Azza was really looking at ancient Egyptian and Nubian architecture. And Azza's really interested in the idea of in the architecture of transformation. And so what you see here is a kind of spiritual structure that is based on the Muslim burial tradition, in the sense that when a family member dies, their body actually goes through a process where their loved ones bathe and wash the body in saline infused oil, and there's also burning the core in the space as well. This idea of preparing the body for the afterlife. In this way, what's interesting is to think about death not necessarily as a finality or as a period in a sentence, but actually as a comma, in the sense that actually there is this sense of something new. And in this case, everything in this installation is kind of becoming new again. Let's say one thing that's important to note, which some people don't realize, is actually these are not just decorative lamps, but they're actually heat lamps that are burning the core, which you can actually smell in the space. You can also smell the scent of Maya oil as well. As you look through here, you can kind of see that these different slip cast sculptures, which are cast from both family heirlooms and objects you got on eBay, they are all in these kind of different states of decay. And Azza in our interview was talking a lot about how during the pandemic, she became more attuned to the idea of positionality, the sense that when we're born, we're kind of enter the world and we're kind of stationed and we enter certain statuses in the world, but some of us get sacrificed before others based on our positions. And so here she's kind of playing with that. You can see that all of these objects started underneath the same conditions, this water that is slowly dripping at kind of different velocities, but some have been spared before others. Some have really retained their form and then others have not. And then when you get to a certain point like this, I mean, all of that material information ends up being absorbed into the water and it becomes part of the very water that actually destroyed it in the first place. Likewise, you can see that since the beginning of the show, the water has also, kind of bared its weight on the actual steel structure, and it's kind of oxidized as well, and now it's turning into this kind of rusted, earthly orange, let's say.
This one really came about to the exhibition. Wasn't necessarily intentional initially, but when we were looking at a site for Azza's work, this is the one we selected, and she really, she's hugging the four columns at the center of the building, at the center of the exhibition. And then she's inserted this additional column with the two hands on each of the four facades. So it really became the heart of the whole project, and the work in this room, and a lot of the work references this kind of circulation of everything going back to nature and coming back to humanity. There's a lot of water references, there's a lot of planetary references.
Yeah, it's a very spiritual floor.
All the artists in this spacecraft machine are shown are female. So yeah, it's interesting when you're creating a project, certain things start layering together, and then when you experience the rhythm, this finality, it's like so much else is revealed.
Absolutely. Then we'll highlight one other project on this floor because we know we are. Yeah. Actually, first we should. Yeah.
This is a new work by Noah Bashuti. When we first started talking to Noah, actually, this is an interesting story for us. We were looking at Noah's practice and didn't know she was based here. So that notion of the local as well is, skewed in terms of she'd been here 2 or 3 years. She mainly still been showing back in the region she comes from, so mainly in Lebanon. And there was one particular video that we wanted to include, and then she, through discussion, decided to actually push that project into a much broader project. So all of her work pretty much stems from a collection of objects she inherited from her father. So her father was an artisan. He was working in Amman in Jordan, and he was creating replicas of artifacts, historical artifacts of buildings, mainly for tourist shops. But these objects, they're highly crafted, they're beautiful. I'll show you a few in a second in this draw. So she's really questioning the notion of what's an original, what's authentic, what do we give value to? And then obviously by extension, thinking about the collections in a museum. What does a museum hold? And a lot of those things that it does hold are often in storage. So there's all this idea again of hidden objects, things being revealed. And here we see all these crafted objects made by her father in a constellation that comes together around one particular object. Here, it's a tiny little double-headed bull and lion. And this kind of is the core of the whole thinking behind how this installation came about. This is a much larger object that her father created. This is a replica. But when she was researching, she found the so-called original in Ohio, in the Cleveland Art Museum. And we actually approached the curator there of antiquities and spoke to him. And he was very interesting because he saw us on camera, he asked to see the object. And then he questioned, what century is it from? And she was like, well, it's from 1970s. And he was like, well, it's not an original then, obviously. And again, it became this whole discussion around, well, what does that word actually mean? And for her, these are all originals. So this little double-headed bull and lion, there are 50 of them that she's produced. There's another one in the building, it's actually hidden in the mashrabiyah. So this idea of also occupying other locations or other work. And then in the constellation of the draw, the objects actually come together and form it's Taurus and Leo, the night sky, which are joined by one star.
And this is kind of another example too, but I was thinking of the idea of something both being in storage and on display that echoes again, reaches kind of down to Walter Scott, right? And this idea of things that are the idea of stores, the idea of, what is presentation, what does it mean to both be presenting and hiding at the same time?
Yeah.
So it's also, I love the different views.
Yeah.
So nice.
You may remember this work from downstairs. So this is the original painting by Julia that formed the curtain that we saw downstairs. So again, this idea of inheritance and seeing, what do you take with you to another form of an exhibition, even? What memories do you hold?
And then here you have two new paintings by Korean and Italy Ferreira. And Korean also was an artist that we didn't realize kind of lived in the GTA. And he's an artist that we kind of discovered near the end of making our artist selection. But what you see here are two paintings that are very much informed by photography. So in this one composition, there might be 5 to 6 elements from a number of photographs that he's kind of composed into this new fictional image. He often goes back to family albums. His family's from the Caribbean and Trinidad. And he goes through all of these 4x6 analog photographs, takes elements of them to create a new composition in Photoshop, and then translates that into a painting. So as an example, it might be that this female figure and this child actually have no relationships to each other. It may be that her dress in this print actually belonged to another woman in another photograph, or that this woman actually was never in the picture as well. And what's interesting is spending time with them, and when you start thinking through this particular photography, in the 20th century, we thought of photography as being proof, evidence. A photograph that existed, it was true. And now in the 21st century, we don't believe any images anymore. So I think those questions are super interesting when it comes to Kareem's painting, the way that the painting kind of evoke those questions. But also, I don't know if this translates necessarily via Zoom, there are these incredible layers of other material information underneath. So Kareem also, these are actually paintings, but they're also collages. Here you can kind of see the imprint of like a snowflake, or here you can kind of see these other kind of cutout shapes. And Kareem, when he goes to the Caribbean, he talked about in our interview, he's always kind of overwhelmed by how much stuff is accrued and kept by his family members. He says, people there really use things till they finally cannot be used anymore, or things are kept to remember loved ones by. So he becomes both moved and overwhelmed by all of that assemblage in people's homes. And so he kind of reflects that in the base layer of his paintings. He actually takes other textiles that he finds or wears that are in the studio, cuts them, flattens them, collages the first layer, and then paints over. So now we're in the North Stairwell. Yes.
See behind the scenes. How prep for this we have. So this floor is much more open plan. It's very sculptural. We titled it Mutation. We were thinking a lot when we were working on this exhibition, on this floor in particular, around acts of doubling, things coming together that may not normally come together to create something that has more potential. The idea of sort of symbiosis within, organic matter, but also, there's a number of works here that bring two different ideas or opinions or constructs together to create a new idea.
So one of those works, which also was really one of the first ones that was probably the most resolved, is by Native Art Department International, which is a collective of artists who are both partners in life and in work, Maria Huckfield and Jason Lujan. And Maria is from the Great Lakes region, and Jason is from Marfa, Texas, so the dry region. And I only say that because this idea of wet and dry, yin and yang, of two opposites coming together also plays a huge part in their work. And so in this case, you have this work called Double Gazebo MOCA. There is also one that is installed outside of the Farley Art Gallery in Markham. And in our interview, Maria was talking a lot about, well, first of all, they became very attuned to the idea of temporary architecture, in the sense that because of the pandemic, all of a sudden, all these like temporary pavilions, let's say, were being made outside of restaurants because it was the only way that one could both be inside and outside, but actually eat and convene safely. So they became very attuned to this idea of, other structures that exist that also make that possible. And in this case, the gazebo. But Maria was talking about around Georgian Bay, where she's from, the idea that she always kind of grew up seeing the kind of white wooden, British gazebo in other people's backyards. And it always became the symbol of a wealthy person's place, a territory that she couldn't necessarily cross or wasn't necessarily available to her. And so here they've actually transformed that and created not one, but two. They're also very interested in this idea of equal footing. And when you look closer, you can see that these are not two gazebos that are butt up against each other. They're actually considered one. And in order to remove one, you have to alter the other. Likewise, there's also this very dark, black, void-like finish, because they were very interested in the fact that, how we've experienced public space in the last 2 years has been as an image. This is also why, if you look down, there are actually stanchions that are not necessarily the museum's decision, but the artist's decision to kind of create this idea of an image, something that cannot be accessed, something that, although it's a three-dimensional structure, is actually experienced two-dimensionally, let's say. While they were also developing this work, they were reading the book In Praise of Shadows, which talks about Eastern and Western thought, and the idea that in the West, we think of enlightenment as being kind of like white and light oriented, but actually in the East, there's thought that the night sky, the deepness and void-like qualities of the night sky actually hold the most infinite possibilities for humanity. And so that's why this work is also a celebration of darkness, of blackness, of opposites, actually. Do you want to talk about Aluches?
So this installation that runs the whole length of the wall is by an artist called Aluche, who actually lives in the neighborhood. We first saw his work, a very small series of sculptures in the Patel Brown Gallery in our studio visit with him. And, he had so many ideas, and this was one of them that was just beginning to take formation. He kind of started the project he was already doing research on the Black families that had come to Canada, in particular the Black Royalists, who were offered land in the 18th century to move to Nova Scotia, to Halifax, to start farming the land. But the land they were offered when they arrived was often not very arable at all. It was smaller than they were promised, and it was often at distance. So they weren't able to form communities and to create kind of an ecosystem of exchange. So all of that trauma and all of those pressures, he really wanted to translate that and put that into dialogue with a notion of a national identity. He started collecting hockey sticks in the local neighborhood just from the street. And then he started sourcing these farm tools. And as you'll see, if you come up close to them, he's merged the two. So he's merged these two different fields, these two playing fields, and is really critiquing the fact that we put so much energy, emphasis, celebration onto the national sport, hockey, and yet we forget, that the land has been toiled upon for centuries by Black individuals, by migrant workers, etc. So kind of honoring that history alongside the one we all acknowledge. And you can see here the blending is very perfectly blended, two objects. And the installation consists of pretty much a whole hockey team.
It's incredible also how the shadows either soften or sharpen the tools as well. Even though it's a very contemporary project, he also was really playing also with the codes of how we treat talismanic objects in kind of encyclopedic museums, but also, in those kind of tools as well. So even though it's a contemporary project, he's also playing and using kind of light to kind of create that kind of in-between space in the presentation.
Yeah, and we spoke a lot about the terminology that's used around play, this idea of an equal playing field, and the fact that it's never an equal playing field. There's so many people that never have access. And then when we come back to this sense of urgency, which we, many of the works you probably see why it felt so urgent for the artist to produce them at this moment. But for Aluche, for example, it was also that he spent some time in Niagara and was really concerned and stressed by the fact that the migrant workers are coming into places like Niagara still. Often Mexicans are coming for 6 months of the year. They have families here, but they have no papers. So this continues. This systemic issues of racism and the abuse of bodies continues. And the cloud that we see kind of the center of the installation sourced from Ottawa quite late in the day for this exhibition, I would say. I mean, the interesting thing about the exhibition is also that not only were we working with all this new work, but we were also having to think about how to install and present the work in every case. You know, so this piece came in about 3 weeks before the exhibition actually opened. And we had to build the plinth at the last minute. But I think it's just interesting to think about, you know, how much in-depth conversation had to happen, even around the detailing of how these works were hung off the wall and to create that balance.
Yeah. And something also really important was that, which I thought was both the most concerning but like energizing aspect, is that we were experiencing, like both ourselves and the artists were experiencing the arrival of their work for the first time, right? Many of these objects were either kind of outsourced or were, you know, being made on site. And so we also had to leave so much room for, which felt like really the most contemporary thing you can do is really commission new work, because you're making decisions in that moment based on those conditions, those circumstances. And so much of the show, you know, at one point it's theoretical for so long, and then all of a sudden it becomes a much more kind of physical exercise, and an exercise about so many other sociopolitical, economic, spatial, geographic things, which this show, I think, across all of them really felt like that, and really felt present. Yeah. Good time for like one more one.
I think so. Are there any more questions coming in?
We haven't had any other questions yet, but if you do have questions, please feel free to add them to the chat and we'll respond to them.
So when you come off the elevators, one of the first works that you encounter is this work by Sahar Tay called Listening Attends. And Sahar works mostly in sound, but this is one of the first times she really was working with an object-based, an object, let's say. And this project really stemmed from this moment where she found herself in the middle of a protest or kind of moment of propaganda, public propaganda in the Middle East. And she identified that although no sound or anything legible was actually coming from the structure, which is a Toyota Land Cruiser and speaker system, that this object was still able to actually dominate the public, was able to control the public. And it was quite imposing. And so she became interested in, you know, what would happen if you recreate that in a museum. Likewise, someone that she refers to in thinking for this project is Ito Sterl, who's written a lot about the idea of war museums. Why do we have war museums? We think that in some ways we create these museums to kind of remember, to also teach, to educate, but at the same time, we also know that there are all of these underground economies and underground communities that are actually trading weapons and trading objects that are based on the fact that, you know, that weapon was used in that battle or was used in that particular circumstance, which is actually quite dark as well. And so this is one of the central questions she's thinking about is, you know, at what point when you bring a tank into the museum, do you transform the museum into a military base? And she actually used this structure for a performance outside of the museum. It was very kind of guerrilla style, let's say, where this truck and this speaker system was set up outside, and she got on top, and actually and a group assembled, and rather than having any kind of legible sound, it was just these breathing patterns over an hour. So also this idea of using this object, which is used usually for violence or propaganda, for something that was actually kind of more human, the idea of human breath, which she also talks about in her interview as being something that is both soothing, but also very annoying. In the sense that there's also the idea of someone breathing too heavily or chewing too loudly can also be an annoyance. So she's also interested in that very almost inaudible sound and kind of what it triggers and kind of what it does. So from a particular distance, as you move towards it, you can actually hear the recording of this performance that she recorded. And then we also, what's interesting also, is we also wrapped it as if it were a collector's item. We worked with a seamstress to actually create this black satin cover for it, which then brings out its more kind of fetishistic qualities. What was interesting is during the opening week, Kim Kardashian had already walked the Met Gala, and many people, when they came in, said, "Oh my God, this is Kim Kardashian," right? What's also interesting is the fact that Kim Kardashian, you know, with Demna from Balenciaga, he dressed her this complete black garment, not dissimilar to this, as a way of kind of camouflaging her, turning her into a mannequin or this nobody, but actually the opposite also happened. So that I would say the idea of fetishization, of anonymity, of control, of presence is all part of this work as well. And then maybe we'll talk about car springers. One more. Or
The last one, yes.
The last one. So this is a work by Cara Springer, who is an artist but also an industrial designer, and it is a light box image. And at the core of Cara Springer's work is this interest in how inherently fragile all of the structures in our life are: emotional, financial, social, psychological. And this is actually an image from a kind of performance that she did in the Bahamas, where she took an industrial ladder and she placed it in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, ran to shore and photographed it just before gravity would kind of bear on the piece and actually collapse it. And so here you have this moment, this object placed in a foreign context, in the way it kind of actually defines its circumstances, the way that it's actually holding itself up, even if just for a second. So it becomes this also beautiful image, a kind of, like I said, protest, of defiance, but also this is the image of a staircase to heaven. The idea of climbing the ladder is also an image that translates across a number of cultures, a number of centuries, and stories. I also call this the newborn baby of the show, because the politics of care are also very important to this piece. The battery that actually powers this work only lasts for 2 hours, which means that we have to constantly come and check up on it to make sure that the battery hasn't run out, which also means, again, with this idea of revealing and concealing, there's actually a battery always charging in the back room. So the work both exists in presentation, but is also being generated and powered in our back room where we're charging the next battery. And so there is this idea of needing to tend to an object, to care for an object, to have it constantly at the tip of our fingers, at the top of our minds, which I think is also a very...
You also that notion of temporality.
Yeah.
Like, the fact that it can go on for any moment.
Yeah.
But it's also installed in a way that's very temporary. It needs to be wheeled and moved into different contexts. And sometimes in the past, you've actually shown the light box on top of the crate with it rising. In this instance, we produce a rolling platform. And then you come around to the back, it is also a double image again, which is pretty unusual when you think about light boxes. So you can see the image with the show in the background, or you can see the image with the city in the background, which is a really nice kind of double juxtaposition.
November, Andrew, Rui, this was fantastic. I hope that this experiment worked out. The show GTA21 is up until
9th of January 2022.
What was for you, what is the most important for you to take away with this particular show?
So that's a deep question.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
I think it was just a really generative experience for us. So I think I have a lot of gratitude for all the artists that participated, not just for the fact that they produced work, they collaborated, but they really allowed that last year to be one of thinking and discussion and coming together. And without that, I think it would have been, for a lot of us, much more bleak, probably less in existence. And we formed so many relationships with so many artists that I think and hope will now, we work with again in the future, and hopefully, they'll have the opportunity, within Canada and beyond, due to this exhibition.
Very nice. So our next talk in the Lost and Found Agency series will be on December 9th with Indigenous artist Megan Marceau on the importance of protected space. Yeah, thank you very much for joining and have a nice Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you.